This is the 40/40 vision strategy. Dale, do you know anything about it?
The year 4040, is that what we're looking for? Or is it a long time away?
We're doing some long-term goals.
Hello and welcome to the Big Con podcast. It's the one dedicated to demystifying and simplifying the world of strategy. We explore the mark on businesses and individuals who've either harnessed it for success or perhaps missed the mark. My name is Dale, big business nerd and self-proclaimed content aficionado.
And I am Emily, Harvard degree candidate.
Listeners, we're bringing you in on the con. We're going to share the valuable lessons from both the failures and the triumphs of those who've come before us. What is it today, Em? Is it a failure? Is it a triumph? What's going on?
Well, I actually have a bit of good news for you. That's happening in Australia, in businesses around Australia. But as we dive in, we might find that while it is definitely good news, could we obtain better news by different means?
Oh,
So I'm being a bit cryptic, but let me tell you about it. This is the 40/40 vision strategy. Dale, do you know anything about it?
is the year 4040? Is that what we're looking for? Or is it a long time away?
Imagine. We're doing some long-term goals.
That's absurd. Like 9-year strategies hurt me, let alone 2,000-year strategy.
Okay, so it is an initiative that is being led by a super fund called Hesta. And they have asked for the ASX 300, so the top 300 companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, to commit to a 40-40-20 gender diversity target, meaning 40% men, 40% women, and 20% identifying as any gender in executive leadership.
That makes more sense.
Executive leadership being the key.
Mhm.
So Hesta, the super fund, when they talk about this strategy, cite research that talks about diversity improving the performance of these companies, which we know that to be true from the research we did for our Home First episode. And they also cite research that shows that organizations that set quantitative targets are more likely to achieve balanced representation, which makes sense, right? Targets help set goals and inform action. So sure. So they also importantly say that at this rate, we will not see equal representation at a CEO level until 2100. So that is a long ways away. What their program is asking for is for companies who elect to participate. So in the ASX 300, out of those, who elect to participate to track their gender balance, report on their progress with medium to long-term targets, and make their plan publicly available. And so the good news that I promised, Dale, is that according to the latest report, between 2020 when it launched to now, it has begun to work. 51% of participants, there are 25 participants, 51% of those have already achieved the goal of gender balance in their executive teams, compared to the 23% of the ASX 300. And 80% of those participating have set interim goals, and many of them have achieved those already. Hesta did really encourage them to set interim goals so we could track progress. So the benefits that these companies have reported, so in their latest report, the companies were saying that they've seen improved retention of staff, that the company culture is better, the skill set to address their future strategies is broader, so they have lots of different skills they can draw on. They've got improved risk management, better innovation, team performance, and of course, reputation of the business has improved, which has positive repercussions in all sorts of areas also. So we're feeling like good news, right?
Everything's up and about. This is good news.
I'm not going to argue with that. However, I'm going to start to poke some holes. I think that there are problems. There have been warnings around setting diversity targets because of how they actually play out. So in an attempt to decrease discrimination, it can actually lead people, specifically those who are not considered diverse, i.e. white men, to feel discriminated against. And before we get our little violins out for the sad white men, let's dive into this article that Paolo Gaudino wrote for Forbes, which we will link to in the comments because it did a really brilliant job of explaining how white men being discriminated against and using targets to eliminate discrimination, both things can be true. I'm basically going to quote Paolo directly here because it is a brilliant summary and I could not write it any better. What we're going to do is we're going to imagine a company with 1,000 employees. 25% or 250 identify as women. 5% identify as Black, Indigenous, and other people of colour, and the remaining 70% identify as white men.
Mhm.
Suppose that leadership sets diversity targets to reach 30% women and 10% BIPOC in 3 years. If the company were to remain the same size, that would mean that 3 years later, there would be 50 more women, 50 more BIPOC people, and 100 fewer white men. So,
Mhm.
at face value, this target means that if you're a white man, you have a 1 in 7 or 14% chance of being terminated because you are a white man. And even as the company is hiring 100 new people, it is hard to describe this as anything but discrimination. However, to those white men out there that are feeling discriminated against, I encourage you not to get angry yet and to keep listening, because the same diversity targets could also lead to a very different conclusion. For
Mm.
example, if the company expects to grow in size by 10% per year, 3 years later, the company will have grown to about 1,331 people. So, using the same diversity targets, that would mean that 799 of the employees will be white men, which is an increase of 99. So, then that shouldn't feel so much like discrimination. But actually, in reality, both of these calculations are inaccurate, because they consider hiring as the only mechanism that changes representation. And as a matter of fact, the low representation of women and BIPOC in most organizations is basically due to the high churn rates for these groups,
Mm.
which can often be twice as high than the churn rates for white men. So I think it's all very interesting. These targets can create polarizing feelings, and depending on what's actually going on with churn rates, with an increase in staff, all those kinds of things. And now we learned again in our Home First episode that these churn rates exist due to a lack of inclusion. So
Mhm.
women and people of color are asked to assimilate in traditional white man business culture rather than being celebrated for the differences and skill sets that they bring to the table. So, what we're seeing here now in relation to the 40/40 vision is that for some groups, these diversity targets feel like discrimination, and for others, they mean that the company is making a promise to work towards ending the discrimination that currently exists.
Mhm.
So now, Dale, we have a bit of a conundrum. And so after the break, let's come back and discuss what we think of diversity targets and whether we talk about other strategies that help improve the diversity that leads to better outcomes, because those outcomes that have been quoted in this report are brilliant and all businesses should want those outcomes. But we don't want to make people feel like they're missing out on opportunities. But then we also don't want, tokenism of people who feel like maybe they got a role that they didn't deserve due to diversity targets. It's a lose-lose for everybody. So what we want to do is try to expand the pie, not divide the pie, so to speak. Are you ready to discuss when we come back?
I'm ready for a break. My head hurts.
Okay, Dale. So I think that we can certainly say that this is complicated.
Yes.
If we are going to have diversity targets, and I think that we should talk about also whether we do or don't, but if we are, then it may require communication. So, for example, we aim for this because we believe in equal opportunity, but this is how we're going to do it. And this is how we're going to ensure the right person gets the role. And this is beneficial to everyone because it shows that the person who is the right fit will get the role. Maybe instead of just sending out numbers, we talk about the benefits of providing opportunity to people who haven't traditionally had opportunity.
I think communication's the point. And I think that's the problem with KPIs, is that they provide an excuse for not communicating, because all they do is they provide like KPIs, key performance indicators. They're a lovely North Star to chuck up on a scorecard or put a metric on. Part of my job is setting some of those KPIs and working with people to do those KPIs. And so I understand the necessity for them in large, complex organizations. Even for small organizations going, hey, we're going to get more customers this year, whatever that might be, then it becomes a swap out or almost a cop out for not having to have a conversation around why we're doing that thing. So if we're getting more customers this year, cool. There is an assumption there that we're doing that because more income coming in, more revenue, more busy, et cetera, et cetera. But then the person down the line is like, more customers, that means I'm going to be more overworked. I don't understand that. So just take the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion lens out of it. KPIs can sometimes introduce a bit of a short-term focus, a bit of stress, and they can reduce morale in that space. And the other thing they do is, which is always the critique, particularly in DEI-based KPIs, people end up gaming the system or feel like that they're working towards and doing things that aren't aligned with the business's mission and vision statement or approach in order to game the system.
Mm.
So they may do things that are not beneficial in support of the KPIs. There's all this other stuff around it, stifles innovation. There's a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach, can be a complete resource drain in setting up KPIs, blah, 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 blah. They have their place, but they need to be carefully considered. Now, KPIs regarding DEI, I think I like the way you said it, because I think that's the nicest way to say it, is that it's not about splitting the pie, it's about expanding the pie. And I think that is a better way to have a conversation around these DEI targets so they don't become tokenistic in some fashion.
Yeah, because nobody wins with tokenism.
Correct.
Nobody.
Correct. And there's been a real move from understanding. So I'll say I'm aware of this, but I haven't been doing too much diving into it. And so I think I'm glad you bring this to our attention. But in America, there's been quite a focus on DEI. There's been a real decline in those policies and the changes in that space. So things like JP Morgan Chase, so the big bank over there, they kind of modified a lot of the DEI policies because they were concerned they were going to get open to litigation. It's also become quite a political space as well. And the main argument is it replaces one type of discrimination for another, which is just not what the intention is at all.
I'm going to acknowledge that it feels uncomfortable to give airtime to the fact that this group that has dominated businesses is now feeling discriminated against. It feels complicated to give that airtime, but I think it's really important if we really want to get to a place where we're moving away from any type of discrimination to look at even the most well-meaning of strategies and how they can actually you can actually miss something. We all want the same thing, which is a welcoming, functional, high-performing workplace. That's what we want to see. And if you're listening to this podcast, I imagine that that's what you want to see too. And that's what you are aiming to get out of your workplace. And it doesn't happen if there are any forms of discrimination or there's any bad blood towards anybody getting a position that other people feel like they don't deserve, whether that's warranted or not, whether this person is actually the right person for the role is irrelevant. It's the perception that people feel hard done by that actually causes some toxicity that is not what you want in a workplace. If that person gets the role, if they're from one of these disadvantaged groups, then potentially they feel like everyone dislikes them because they've unfairly got some position and then they leave. And that's what leads to the churn rates. So it seems like a Band-Aid solution. Like, if this 40-40 vision is reporting on they've hit these diversity targets, my next question is how long are they this diverse for? If the churn is higher for those disadvantaged groups. And I think while we're talking about disadvantage, I think when we're hiring, it's really important to recognize disadvantage too, which is that I don't believe that it is discrimination if you choose someone who hasn't had access to education or experience, but you see them as being a great fit, a fast learner, and someone that will thrive with an opportunity. I don't think it's discriminating to choose them over someone who has technically more experience on paper when you feel that ultimately they won't be as good in the position. And you're providing opportunity to someone to get ahead and move forward because of their talent, their dedication, and their skill, as opposed to where they've come from and what opportunities have been provided to them in the past. So I think potentially moving a conversation away from targets and into how do we create an environment that is a place that everyone wants to work and everyone has an opportunity provided to them, that might be more productive.
I believe we'll move away from strict quotas and things like that. I think that's kind of where it will move towards. I don't believe there's any silver bullet for this in the immediate.
No.
I think going back to what Hesta's doing with the project is actually really nice because these conversations are hard and that's what they are. They're conversations because end of the day, any good hiring manager should have a conversation with the person who wasn't successful for the role and outline the reasons in which they weren't successful, whether that is
Mm-hmm.
the other person was more appropriate for the role.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's hard to hear. And any good hiring manager should then outline the places in which they could improve. But what this does, because that is a hard conversation to have regardless, and hard
Yeah.
conversations are easier to have when you have data and when you have information, you have other sources from other places which can start to be like, oh, this is what another organization in the top 300 ASX listed companies, this is what they're doing. So how are we matching up? How are we comparing? It's a very human thing to be able to do. This is a human problem, and humans like to have a point of comparison, whether rightly or wrongly.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, look internally, look at yourself, look at what you're doing in your own space, but this provides a rich data set, a really interesting data set to be able to start to have those conversations from a point of reason and logic and start to go, oh, that's what they're doing. Do we want to do better, or are we doing worse? Or are we doing what we should be doing in this space? I think that's really important to start to do. It's kind of around having those conversations and creating an environment for those conversations, which again goes to what you were saying around creating a culture. I was thinking, I played out just then when we were speaking around, there's no world where you're going to employ someone who's perhaps on paper not the best solution, but you've got a really good vibe and fit in them. You're not going to sit there and go, everyone, this is Terry. He's not at all qualified, but got a good feel about him. Got a bloody good feel about him. But your job as a manager, as a leader, as someone in a position of power, which I'm assuming you are if you're focusing on these issues, is to be able to support that person to do the best that they can in that space, whether that's through communication and making sure that and explaining to them how they can succeed and explaining to the other people that they're going to be working with how they can succeed and be a functioning team member. It's your job. I think that's kind of where it goes back to, is around this is a leadership.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you used the Terry example, because I'd like to flesh out what I was saying a little bit further, I think, in that I don't mean that Terry is completely inappropriate for the position, because obviously their resume got them through to the interview. Potentially we can be a bit more open with entry level positions, because Terry didn't go to university, but Terry was the manager at McDonald's since he graduated high school, and Terry has shown leadership and aptitude for working in a fast-paced environment and blah 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 blah, whereas old mate over here, who's the other one, comes in with a master's degree in whatever we're doing but hasn't worked it out in the world at all. It's about also thinking like, okay, well, is Terry shown aptitude, and do I think Terry will thrive in this opportunity, versus do I think that this other person will thrive who's been it's like, oh, well, they've got a master's degree. I don't think it should be the deciding factor in hiring, which I think it often is.
No, I've quoted Scott Galloway before, but the quote was around university degrees have become a way for big companies to vet a certain amount of people. And so they come out with a degree and they go, cool, well, they've gone through that. They're from a certain socioeconomic class. They've got this certain degree. I know that they're from this, they're almost a safe hire in that respect. They know what they're going to get. And if you're looking for a business that's going to be different, it's going to match the incredibly diverse customer set that you may be going for.
Yeah.
Surely you're wanting something outside the cookie cutter.
But it's also foolish to think that, and like this is coming from someone who has degrees coming out of her butt. Like I have so many, because I love study, and that, like, I just love it. I love learning. I love exploring. That's why I do it. And I'm in a very lucky position to be able to do it. I also wouldn't want someone to give me a job because I have all these pieces of paper. I would want someone to give me a job because they liked the way that I was going to approach the role, and they liked the way that I was going to integrate with the team and do some teamwork, and my future forward thinking about the position and what I could make it. And that's the stuff that I get really excited about. The degree helps me do those things, sure, but it's not the reason why I might be good at it. And I think that there are smart people out there that haven't got that opportunity who could thrive in the right environment.
My only piece of advice a lot from this, it's unfortunately become Dale's hiring advice. Request all the resumes. Don't go through a vetting process through a third party. If you're a hiring manager, a good hiring manager, request all the resumes. There is, I'm sure, the AI technology that's coming through and the various vetting processes, they're good for an extent, but you owe it to at least have a gander at all the resumes you get, because unfortunately some of these biases that come through, whether unconscious or through the systems we use, they take out what could be a really good applicant. And you could owe it to yourself and you owe it to that person to have a gander at what they're submitting.
I think that's a really good point. I think that we should be looking at our hiring processes in a deeper and more meaningful way than what the numbers are.
Well, listeners, there you have it. You now understand a little bit more of the con. We hope that you have not settled on a 2,000-year strategy and are doing something much more appropriate, maximum 10-year strategy, I say, in the future. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Big Con podcast. It not only supports us, but it means that you get all the latest episodes straight to your device. Do not keep all the fun to yourself. Share the con around your mother, your aunt, your best friend's brother. Tell them to check us out on all your favorite podcast apps, and I mean all of them. For any further details, please head over to our website, thebigconsultingagency.com, and sign up to the mailing list. Bye for now. This podcast was recorded in the land of the Woiwurrung language groups. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.